Welcome back.
Welcome back, family, to Hear Us Out. I'm Renee,
I'm Curry.
and as always, thank you to our longtime subscribers who've been with us since the very beginning, and to anyone here who is finding us for the first time or you heard about us. Make sure to hit subscribe so that you can continue to get notifications to hear us out.
Yeah, thank you. And in this episode, we will be beginning something of a study of Plato.
Yeah.
A study, analysis, and discussion of Plato.
hmm
And this is kind of off the back of our last episode where we had the we went through the thought experiment of the eternal recurrence,
Right.
and which is a very old thought experiment that comes
hmm
from old ancient Greece and stuff like that.
hmm
And we were initially thinking about, well, because we quoted Nietzsche a lot,
Right.
and we literally talked about one of his books,
right.
that spoke Zarathustra. We're like, why don't we actually read
hmm
some Nietzsche? Like, well, why don't we actually do a whole like philosophical discussion,
Right.
literally about philosophy,
hmm
and make it turn it into more of a thing,
Right.
right? And so we start, and why not begin with, perhaps one of the most well-known of
Right.
the ancient Greek philosophers,
hmm
that's Plato.
right? And I like the fact that, we're starting with Plato too, not so much because he is the first, because we don't even want to get into all of that, but if any of our listeners have ever read or know the works of Marimba Ani, then we know how much a lot of her work is not so much that it's based, on
Mm-hmm.
Plato, but she references Plato a lot in her book Urugu.
Mm-hmm.
So, if you read Ani's book, then you're familiar with the phrase. I think she says, the Platonic as epistemological mode, and
Mm-hmm.
that comes from what we're going to, read and discuss.
Yeah,
So I felt like, it's pretty much on time and in line, so that you'll have another frame of reference in reading her works or in anything else that you
yeah,
decide to.
really anything,
Yeah.
because this is kind of the bedrock of
Mhm.
modern philosophy.
Mhm.
I guess from a Western point of view,
Yeah.
a lot
Yeah.
of Western
Right.
philosophical
Mhm.
ideals come from
Yeah.
you
Plato.
know
Mhm.
from Plato,
Mhm.
and we'll see that Plato comes from Socrates, but
Mhm.
Socrates was not a writer. He didn't write
Mhm.
things down. He kind of just was a lecturer
Yeah.
at that moment,
Mhm.
at his time, and Plato was a student of
Mhm.
his. And but when Socrates died, he didn't have any great works and stuff like that. So Plato, and this is not just Plato, but a lot of
Mhm.
philosophers at the time, they were write down
Mhm.
their philosophical ideas or philosophical arguments in something called in Socratic dialogue,
Mhm.
which pretty much means they create this situation
Mhm.
where Socrates is arguing a particular point
Mhm.
with some character they
Right.
created to have this
Conversation.
conversation
Right.
with Socrates. And we were debating on just going right into the Republic, which
Mhm.
is Plato's seminal work
Mhm.
that a lot of people like to reference. But we have this book
Yeah.
filled with all these
Yeah.
dialogues of Plato. We're like, ah, why
Well,
not? Why
we'll
not?
just we'll just do
Let's
the
just
whole
start at
thing.
the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, and I've been having, and like I told you, I've been having that book. I want to say probably since 1992.
Mm-hmm.
It's one of the few things that has stayed with me
Mm-hmm.
pretty much a lot of my life. I don't know why that's the book, but
Mm-hmm.
that's the one that has been around. So yeah, and when you read it, I told you, I'm like, this is the same
Yeah.
one that I read back in the '90s. So
Yeah.
here we
So
are.
this is, I said, we've read this before. We've went
Mhm.
over this before, but kind of in our own
Yeah.
phases. It's the first time we were visiting this on the show.
Mhm.
And the very first dialogue
Mhm.
here is called Ion.
Mhm.
And there's a little introductory thing that I want to read here. It says, This is a dialogue between Socrates and the rhapsode or reciter Ion of Ephesus, who declares himself unequaled as a reciter and exponent of Homer. The rhapsodes, song stitchers, were men who made a living by giving public recitations from the great epic poets, chiefly Homer. The most successful held large audiences spellbound. Excuse me. Spellbound, and moved them to amazement, laughter, or tears. Excuse me.
Mm-hmm.
They also lectured or taught.
Mm-hmm.
Socrates suggests to Ion that his skill as a reciter and his hold on his audiences are due to divine inspiration passed down to him through the poet, and shows up as absurd the claims of the reciter to teach practical rules of conduct from Homer. The dialogue foreshadows the views on art as a whole, which are explained in the Republic,
Mm-hmm.
which is something we're going to get to
Yeah.
later on.
Mm-hmm.
So let's begin.
Yeah. Let's begin.
And this is very common. Let's say it goes between Socrates
Tease
and
and
Ion.
Ion, right?
All right.
Mm-hmm.
So at the I don't really. Socrates starts off the
Right.
conversation. The very
It's
first line is Socrates,
mm-hmm.
and then the second line is Ion, and
And
that's
then it's
how it
pretty
goes
much
the
how it
entire
goes.
time.
Right. Mm-hmm.
So this is Socrates speaking.
Mm-hmm.
Good morning, Ion. Where have you now come from in your travels? From home? From Ephesus? Or no, Socrates, from Epidaurus. I have been at the feast of Asclepius. Did the Epidaurians hold a contest of reciters of poetry in honor of the god? Yes, of course, and in other fine arts also. Well, and did you compete, please? And how did your contest go? First prize is what I want, Socrates. Well done. Now then, we must win the Panathenea too. So we will, please God. The Panathenea is I had to look it up,
Mm-hmm.
and apparently the Panathenea is a great festival held in Athens from 56 BC to 3rd century AD,
Mm-hmm.
which is a very long time. And apparently it was a competition
Mm-hmm.
that it was a sports competition, also a religious and cultural competition
Mm-hmm.
where all the great reciters and
Right.
poets and philosophers and
Yeah.
singers and stuff and
The great
athletes
speech
will
contest. You're
come together.
right. Right.
Yeah, so it was a something of a so you had athletic
Mm-hmm.
competitions, chariot races and all the other
Right.
stuff that they did back then, and you also had this cultural fixture,
Mm-hmm.
which was the reciters and
Mm-hmm.
the singers. All right. I have often envied you reciters and that art of yours, Ion. You have to dress in all sorts of finery and make yourselves as grand as you can to live up to your art. And you are at the same time bound to spend your time on no end of good poets, especially Homer, the best and most divine of all poets. You have to learn his meaning thoroughly, not only his verses. Another enviable thing, for no one could be a good reciter unless he understood what the poet says. Yes, the reciter must be the interpreter of the poet's mind to the audience, and to do this, if he does not understand what the poet says, is impossible. So all that very properly makes one envy. Very true, Socrates. At least I've found this myself the most troublesome part of the art, and I believe I can speak on Homer better than any other man alive. Not Metrodorus of Lampascus or Stesimbrotus the Thesian, not Glucon, nor anyone else who ever was born could utter so many fine thoughts on Homer as I can. I'm glad to hear it, I am, for it is clear you won't mind giving me a show. I will most certainly. You'll find it a treat to hear, Socrates, how finely I have decked out Homer. I believe I've earned a golden crown from the Homer Association. I also had to look this up.
Mm-hmm.
The Homer Association.
Mm-hmm.
Right, you can tell where the translation comes in
Right.
because I'm like, I don't think that
Right.
was a thing that existed at the time. But apparently, the Homer Association or the Homer Homeridae
Mm-hmm.
were just this group of people, this family, I guess, who claimed descent from Homer.
Mm-hmm.
Now, modern day historians have never been able to verify this claim, but
Mm-hmm.
this is thousands of years
Yeah, of
later,
course.
so we don't actually know.
Mm-hmm.
But apparently, they held some sway,
Right.
in that in that particular community,
Mm-hmm.
and I guess it was a great honor
Mm-hmm.
to be
Right.
acknowledged
By this
by the
particular
by
group.
this particular house
Hmm.
that claimed descent from Homer.
Hmm.
So yeah, many things. I'll make leisure to hear it sometime, but just answer me one question now. Are you as good at Hesiod and Eurycles, or only Homer? Only Homer, no
Hmm.
one else.
Hmm.
I think Homer's quite enough. But is there anything which Homer and Hesiod speak about and say the same? Yes, I think so. So good many things. Well then, in such matters, could you explain what Homer says better than what Hesiod says? Oh, just the same, Socrates, when they say the same. What about when they don't say the same? For example, they both say something about divination. Yes, certainly. Well then, could a good diviner explain better what these two poets say about divination, both when they say the same and when they don't? Or could you? A diviner could. But if you were a diviner, and if you were able to explain what was said the same, you would know how to explain what was said otherwise. That's obvious. And how it comes is that you are good at Homer, but not at Hesiod and the other poets. Does not Homer speak about those very things which all other poets speak of?
Hmm.
War, now. Has not he said nearly everything about war and the intercourse of men together, good men and bad men, craftsmen and laymen, about the gods' dealings with men and with each other, how they do it, about what happens in heaven and in the house of Hades, and the origins of gods and heroes? Are not these the things about which Homer made his poetry? That is quite true, Socrates. And the other poets, did they not speak of these same things? Yes, they did, Socrates, but not as Homer did. What then? Worse than Homer? Much worse. And Homer did it better. Better indeed. I should think so, by Zeus. Now listen, dear heart alive. Suppose there are several people talking about number, and one speaks much better than the rest. I suppose somebody will be able to pick out the good speaker. I should say, will it be the same person who can also pick out the bad speaker or somebody else? The same, I suppose. Well, this will be the person who has arithmetic, the art of numbers. Yes, very well. Suppose a number of people discussing which foods are healthy, and one speaking much the best. Will the same person recognize that the best speaker speaks best and the worst worse? Or will one person recognize the best and another the worst? The same, that's clear, I suppose. Who is he? What's his name? Doctor.
Hmm.
So we should say that in general, the same person will always know who speaks well and who speaks badly when a number of people are speaking about the same things. Or else, if he does not know the bad speaker, it is clear he will not know the good speaker either. One and the same. Just so. Then the same person is good at both? Yes. Very well. You say then that both Homer and the other poets, two of them being Hesiod and Eurycles, speak about the same things, but not in the same way. That Homer speaks well and the others not so well. Yes, I do say so, and it is true. Then, if you recognize the one who speaks well, you would recognize the one who speaks worse,
Hmm.
and know that they do speak worse. Yes, so it seems. Then, my dear fellow, if we say Ion is good at Homer and good at the other poets alike, we shan't be wrong, since you admit yourself that the same person is a sufficient judge of all that speak about the same things, and the poets pretty well all poetize the same things. Very well, Socrates. Kindly explain the reason for something I am about to tell you. When someone speaks about any other poet, I can't attend. I can't put in one single remark to the point. I'm just in a doze. But only mention Homer, and I'm wide awake in a jiffy. And I attend, and I have plenty to say. Well, that's not hard to guess, old fellow. Anyone can see that not by art and science are you able to speak about Homer. For if art made you able, you would be able to speak about all the other poets too. For there is, I suppose, an art of poetry as a whole, isn't there? Yes. Well, now, if one gets a grasp of any other art whatever, the whole of it, the same way of looking at your problem holds good for all the arts, doesn't it? Would you like me to say what I mean, my dear Ion? I should indeed, my dear Socrates. I love to listen to a clever man like you. I only wish that were true, my dear Ion. But clever, you are the clever ones, you reciters and actors and the poets whose verses you chant. All I can do is tell the truth, as any plain man can do. Just look at my question, how plain and simple it is. Everyone recognizes, as I said, that if one takes any art as a whole, it is the same problem for all arts. Suppose for our discussion we take, say, painting. There is a general art of painting, isn't there? Yes. And there have been many painters, good and bad, certainly. Well, have you ever seen anyone who was good at Polygonus, son of Agalaphon, and could show which of his paintings are good and which are not, but what the other painters are incapable? When someone shows him works of painters, does he just doze and has nothing to say and can't put in a remark? But when he has to give an opinion about Polygonus or any other one painter that you may choose, does he wake up and take notice? And does he find plenty to say? Oh, dear me, no, not at all. Well, then, take a sculptor. Did you ever see anyone who was good at Daedalus, Medon's son, or Epeius, Panopus' son, or Theodorus the Simeon, or any other one sculptor, and could explain all his good work, but before the work of any other sculptor is dumbfounded, starts dozing, and has nothing to say? Oh, dear me, no, I have not seen him either. Go on, then, to piping and harping and singing to the harp and reciting poetry. You saw never a man, as I think, who was good at discoursing on Olympius or Themis or Orpheus or Phymus, the Ithacan reciter. But is struck dumb before Ion the Ephesian, and has no remark to make when he recites well or ill. So let's stop right here
Right.
for a moment, because this whole portion of the conversation is just Plato, Pla- Socrates
Yes.
as Socrates as Ion, you know, about Homer,
Mm-hmm.
and why is it
That
that what makes Homer
Homer
any better
better.
or
That's right.
worse than any of the other
Mm-hmm.
poets he talks about? What as a reciter,
Mm-hmm.
right? Someone who is, an expert in Homer, who is very familiar with the works of Homer,
Mm-hmm.
right? And with the other poets as well.
Mm-hmm.
What makes, Homer any better or
Right.
any worse than, or makes the others any worse than him,
Mm-hmm.
right? And Ion can't really say other than
Mm-hmm.
the fact that Homer moves him, whereas
Mm-hmm.
the other poets cannot.
Right. So, is the best or worst? Is that determined by how you feel or
In
what you
this
know?
particular case,
Mm-hmm.
in this particular case, because the entire time he goes about, is someone speaks well on
Right.
numbers, right? Or if someone speaks well on food,
Mm-hmm.
you would call that person a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
Someone speaks well on numbers, you would call that person
Mm-hmm.
an arithmetician.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who's good for numbers,
Right.
right? And that person is able to speak on the totality of that thing,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
So why is it that you, as a
The reciter.
reciter,
Right.
cannot speak on the totality of poetry?
Mm-hmm.
That is your field, quote
Right.
unquote.
Mm-hmm.
Why can't you speak on these things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's pretty much what Ion asks, says to asks, and he didn't really ask it,
Right.
but he says that to Plato. It's
Mm-hmm.
like, I can tell you that I am moved by the works of Homer. I am
Right.
not moved by the works of these other people.
Mm-hmm.
And then Socrates goes on to explain and say, well, that's because these things are not particularly art,
Mm-hmm.
and that's something we're going to get to pretty
Right.
much like
Right.
right now
Right.
after this point. But
Mm-hmm.
the entire time he's trying to establish the frailty of Ion's argument
Mm-hmm.
and what makes Homer any better than anyone else,
Mm-hmm.
right? Even though Socrates himself said that Homer was the greatest of these poets,
Mm-hmm.
you know. So the thing that makes Homer any greater than Hesiod and the
Mm-hmm.
rest is not something that is as clear as what
Right.
makes a doctor
Right.
better in their particular
Right.
field
We'll
than
say
any
the
other doctor.
like we use the term, tangible or concrete.
Yeah.
Right. The thing that the doctor knows or that the arithmetician knows
Hmm.
is the thing that's concrete.
Yeah.
Right.
That is tangible.
That is tangible. For the reciter,
Hmm.
what he knows, it can't be quantified the way that the doctor or the
Hmm.
arithmetician can
Yeah.
quantify knowing.
But
So
it's still,
yeah.
yeah, but still, even then,
Mhm.
it's like
Yeah.
a doctor can only speak on their particular field of study,
Right.
right?
Right.
Like a doctor of health cannot speak on the, on human health, cannot speak on the health of an animal,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what's making them sick.
Right.
Those are two separate fields,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a mathematician, right? There's a difference between a theoretical
Mm-hmm.
mathematician and an applied mathematician,
Right.
right? The theory of numbers and the application of numbers
Mm-hmm.
are two separate things,
Thanks. Right.
right? So even then,
Mm-hmm.
these people can only really speak on that particular field that
Mm-hmm.
they are familiar with.
Right.
That's obviously one of the flaws in Socrates' logic here is
Right.
that one of the big flaws of Greek philosophy at the moment
Mm-hmm.
during this time was that everything had to be perfect.
Perfect. Right.
Everything had to be, like these perfect circles, these
Mm-hmm.
perfect encapsulations, categorized and
Right.
all the stuff where it needs to be. So he's making these rough generalizations,
Mm-hmm.
and to his point, he does admit that they are generalizations,
Relations. Right.
right? But he's making these, approximate
Right.
generalizations about people in their particular fields and about their capabilities in describing and talking about these
Mm-hmm.
things. So he can make the point that poetry
Mm-hmm.
and what Homer does
Mm-hmm.
is not equatable to what the doctor does and to what the
Yeah.
mathematician
Right.
does.
It doesn't allow for nuances. I guess is it doesn't allow for that. It's rigid and
Well, it's nuanced to a point, to where
mm-hmm.
like he's able to distinguish the difference between what Homer does and what the rest,
All right.
what all the others do,
Mm-hmm.
and he also is able to understand that art is not a tangible,
Right. Right.
thing.
Mm-hmm.
Is not in well because
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 it's left up to but that is
but
interpretation
no, but it's like his whole thing is that, which we're going to see
as we continue to read.
as we
Right.
continue to read, is that there's a difference in his mind, because when he says art, he equates it to science,
Mm-hmm.
or he equates it to a practical, tangible field,
Right.
right, of study,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what art is.
Mm-hmm.
It is a tangible field of study. But what Homer does, and what the
Mm-hmm.
poets do, and what the reciters do, is not a tangible
But the
field of
field is
study.
right.
It's not really an art,
Mm-hmm.
as he said earlier. It's more of, as he's going to get into later, it's something more
More. Mm-hmm.
than this tangible field of art.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and he's going to get into that right here at this
Yeah.
point. But then that entire the backdrop right there was just establishing,
Thing. Right.
you know,
The thing that he's really about to get
the
into.
point that he's
Right.
really about to
Uh-huh.
make. He's establishing the fact that Ion cannot speak on these things
Mm-hmm.
because it isn't a tangible field to be spoken on.
Spoken. That's right.
You know.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
We'll get into that. Yeah.
So let's continue.
Yeah.
All right. Ion is speaking here. I can't contradict you there, Socrates. But one thing I do know about myself, I speak about Homer better than any other man alive. I have plenty to say, and I'll declare that I speak well. But yet about the others, no. Do just see what I means. What do just see what that
Mm-hmm.
means. I do see, my dear Ion, and I'm going to show you what I think that means. Really, as I said just now, this is no art in you to speak well about Homer. No, some divine power is moving you, such as there is in that stone which Euripides called the Magnesian, but most people call it the Heraclean stone. The magnet attracts iron rings, and the magnet attracts iron rings.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, but puts the same power into the iron rings
Right.
so that they can do the same as the stone does.
Mm-hmm.
They attract other rings, and so that sometimes there is a whole long string of these rings hanging together, and all depend for their power on that one stone. So the muse not only inspires people herself, but through these inspired ones, others are inspired and dangled in a string. In fact, all the good poets who make epic poems use no art at all, but they are inspired and possessed when they utter all these beautiful poems. And so are the good lyric poets. These are not in their right mind when they make their beautiful songs, but they are like corybants out their wits, dancing about. As soon as they mount on their harmony and rhythm, they become frantic and possessed, just as the Bacchic woman, possessed and out of their senses, draw milk and honey out of the rivers. So the souls of these honey singers does just the same as they say themselves. The poets, as you know, tell us that they get their honey songs from honey founts of the muses, and pluck from what they call muses' gardens and muses' dells, and bring them to us, like honeybees, on the wing themselves like the bees, and what they say is true. For the poet is an airy thing, a winged and holy thing, and he cannot make poetry until he becomes inspired and goes out of his senses, and no mind is left to him. So long as he keeps possession of this, no man is able to make poetry and chant oracles. Not by art, then. They make their poetry with all those fine things about all sorts of matter, like your speeches about Homer,
Mm-hmm.
not by art, but by divine dispensation. Therefore, the only poetry that each one can make is what the muse has pushed him to make. One ecstatic odes, one hymns of praise, one songs for dance or pantomime, one epic, one satiric iambic. In every other kind, each one of them is a failure. For not by art do they speak these things, but by divine power. Since if an art taught them how to speak well in one kind, they could do it also in all other kinds. Therefore, God takes the mind out of the poets and uses them as his servants. And so also those who chant oracles and divine seers, because he wishes us to know that not those we hear, who have no mind in them, are those who say such precious things, but God himself is a speaker, and through them he shows his meaning to us. A very strong piece of evidence for the argument is of Chalcis, who never made one poem which a man would think worth mentioning except only the hymn of praise which all the world sings. Well nigh most beautiful of all lyrics, really and truly a godsend from the muses, as he calls it himself. Here, most of all, I think God has shown us, beyond all dispute, that these beautiful poems are not human, not made by man, but divine, and made by God. And the poets are nothing but the God's interpreters, possessed each by whatever God it may be. Just to prove this, God purposely sang the most beautiful of songs to the meanest of poets. Don't you think I speak the truth, my dear Ion? Upon my word, I do. You touch my soul in some way by your words, my dear Socrates. I feel sure that a divine dispensation from heaven for us makes good poets to interpret us in these things.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, that was the he was building
Right,
up
he's
to
building up to
the
that
whole
crescendo,
thing,
I guess, right?
right? And like he says, like I said, he draws the distinction
Mm-hmm.
between art,
Right.
which is the tangible
Mm-hmm.
in this particular conversation,
Station, right.
and the intangible,
Mm-hmm.
which is the divine. And he says that poets do not actually poets can only work through divine dispensation,
Mm-hmm.
or the only poetry that is truly poetry, that is
Mm-hmm.
truly worth remembering, and that truly moves a person,
Mm-hmm.
that truly moves the poet and the audience,
Right.
is the one that comes from that divine source. And he
Mm-hmm.
likens it like to a magnet,
Mm-hmm.
and how when you have this magnetic stone
Mm-hmm.
and you put an iron ring to it,
Right.
right? That iron ring is then able to attract
Right.
other iron
It's
rings, and so on
magnetized
and
and so
so
on
on and
forth.
so
Mm-hmm.
on, creating a chain
Mm-hmm.
that links you directly to this divine source,
Mm-hmm.
right? And what an artist is, what a poet or reciter is not someone who is creating something in and of itself,
Mm-hmm.
but is actually creating a link on a chain
Mm-hmm.
that is connecting them and all the people on that chain to this divine
Fine. Right.
source. So they're, like he says, they're actually interpreters.
Mm-hmm.
They're interpreters who
Yes.
are
They are
interpreting
able.
this
Right.
divine dispensation.
Right. They are able to to say and explain. I'm gonna say realities. In a way that that the scientist or the arithmetician can't.
And
And
he likens it literally to oracles.
yeah, yeah.
And like I said, that's one of the things that you have to keep in mind when
Mm-hmm.
you go back and read a lot of, you know, a lot of the old philosophical thinkers and a
Mm-hmm.
lot of like old scientific works,
Mm-hmm.
is that they weren't just trying to explain the physical world.
Right.
They were also trying to explain, the spiritual
Mm-hmm.
world. These things, there was no distinction,
Right.
in these things in their mind. So
Right.
when you go back and you read a lot of these, and it looks ridiculous. Like,
Mm-hmm.
what are you talking
Right.
about? And stuff like that. How can you possibly think that Earth is the center of the galaxy
Right.
and everything moves and
Mm-hmm.
all these rings and stuff like that? How
Mm-hmm.
can you possibly? Because they weren't just trying to explain
Right.
the material reality.
Mm-hmm.
There was a spirituality about their science.
Mm-hmm.
And according to how they lay it out, they wouldn't even call it a
Right.
science,
That's right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
It's not really a science. It's
Mm-hmm.
not really tangible in
Mm-hmm.
that way, you know. And I like how he goes about he goes about saying that how when a singer really gets into it, or when a poet gets
Mm-hmm.
really, it seems as if they're
Possessed.
possessed
Right.
by an otherworldly thing.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like that. I, that reminds me so much of like when anthropologists
Mm-hmm.
first like started to go into Africa and outside
Mm-hmm.
of what the first reasons were when they
Right.
really went there to study,
Mm-hmm.
right? And they talked about the savagery and all
Mm-hmm.
that stuff and how everything was so primal.
Yeah. Animated. Nah.
Everything was
No.
so primal, and it's
Mm-hmm.
like because they call that from in a religious context that's
Mm-hmm.
called ecstatic.
Mm-hmm.
Everything's very ecstatic,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was very off-putting to them.
Mm-hmm.
It seemed very like savage, like
Mm-hmm.
they doing all this stuff and
Right.
it's like, but to Plato,
Right.
and
That's
to
just.
that was the only
Mm-hmm.
viable or the only worthy,
Mm-hmm.
avenue and access for actual divine,
Right.
intercourse.
Mm-hmm.
Like everything was very ecstatic.
Mm-hmm.
The way he describes it.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks about this poet, this Tynnicus of Chalcis, who
Right.
created all these poems from an art form,
Right.
right? And none of
But
them,
that's right.
none of them were worthy of being
Right.
mentioned or
Mm-hmm.
even remembered. But the one
One.
that
Mm-hmm.
was a hymn
Right.
for whatever God he made it
Mm-hmm.
for, and that right there,
Mm-hmm.
that is as well known. Everybody knows that one,
Right.
and that is because he was moved
Mm-hmm.
by a divine dispensation, by a
Mm-hmm.
divine cause,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so he likens the whole thing to this otherworldly cause
Mm-hmm.
that creates these human effects,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it says I can agree with that up to a
To yeah,
point,
to a certain extent.
and
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
yeah, to a certain extent, up to a point, mainly because what translation is an art form.
Yeah.
Being able to translate a thing,
Mm-hmm.
you know, being able to translate, this from
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 Greek
Greek
to
to
English.
English.
Right.
That is an art form,
Mm-hmm.
right? So what we're reading here isn't actually what
Right.
Plato said.
Right.
It's what it's the best
Mation.
approximation
Mm-hmm.
that this translator can do,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that in and of itself is an art form.
Mm-hmm.
So when Homer created his, great works of art, his
Mm-hmm.
great poems, or when all of those artists, in that time created their great art, great works, it still took them to create it.
Right.
You
Mm-hmm.
know, they weren't shunted out of. It's like I said, like the sculpture may be in the stone,
Mm-hmm.
but it still takes human hands
Right.
to make that sculpture.
Mm-hmm.
That in and of itself is an art form.
Mm-hmm.
And what I mean by art is that it's human.
Mm-hmm.
It's a human pursuit. It's not fully divine.
Mm-hmm.
You know, it may have a like I said, it may have a divine cause,
Right.
an otherworldly
Right.
cause. And the way I like to describe it is that an ineffable
Mm-hmm.
cause. And ineffable means there's no word for it.
Mm-hmm.
There's no word to describe this thing.
Mm-hmm.
So it may have an ineffable cause,
Mm-hmm.
but it has a very human effect. And that interplay. that whole interplay is not purely ineffable. There
Mm-hmm.
is, you know, a very
People, human, right?
human
Uh huh.
aspect to this
Mm-hmm.
that is tangible,
Right.
that is not fully metaphysical,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that was one of Plato's big things, was the metaphysical,
Mm-hmm.
right? The ideal in a sense, right? But that's a whole nother
Yeah. So
conversation.
no, no,
We'll
yeah.
get into that later.
Right. Right.
But Plato's and those Socrates's view of art is that art is tangible
Right.
and is not really worthy
Mm-hmm.
of any actual analysis and or discussion.
Mm-hmm.
That the only truly worthy art, the only actual,
Mm-hmm.
works
Right.
aren't art at all, but are actually divine
Sensations. Right.
dispensations.
Mm-hmm.
They are divine messages,
Right.
right? That have been interpreted
Mm-hmm.
by the poets
Mm-hmm.
and disseminated that way.
Mm-hmm.
So he's not saying that art isn't real. When he said that art is far too tangible.
Right.
It's far too
That's what I'm about to say.
human.
Yeah.
It's too
Right. It's
real
too real.
to
Mm-hmm.
be worthy and to
Mm-hmm.
actually move a people, to
Mm-hmm.
move someone,
Right.
right? And I think that's a point that is touched on in one of the Dune books,
Mm-hmm.
where it talks about why religion can't fully die in
Mm-hmm.
a sense because science is far too human.
Mm-hmm.
It's far too practical.
Mm-hmm.
It's too real, quote
Right.
unquote, too
Even
physical.
though today I think that many of us think of art as this, as not, so scientific, I guess you could say.
Well,
We think of art as more, as the interpretation. You know, it tends to we think of, even in even when we engage, with poetry and all of the other things, we look at the how it is that it's how it's delivered. We don't get into the,
well, it depends. It
well,
depends
well, yeah,
on,
of course.
I guess, the person discussing it because
Mm-hmm.
there is a very academic study
Well, yeah,
of these things.
yeah, yes, yes. I mean, even for teaching poetry, right? You
Mhm.
get into those things like iambic pentameters and couplets,
Yeah,
those
but I'm
those
like
type of things.
on that. There's very like I said, there's very academic ideal as to what makes Homer better,
Better. Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
Whereas from Plato's point of view,
Right.
is that there is like it's ineffable
Mm-hmm. That's
what
right.
makes him better.
Right.
There is no reason
Mm-hmm. That's right.
for it.
That's true.
You
Right.
know,
Mm-hmm.
it's just how you feel, and that
Yes, that's what I said. Right.
feeling
That feeling. Right. How
has
you feel.
a divine
Mm-hmm.
cause, right? Has a divine
Mm-hmm.
cause, and that's one of the things that I said it is relevant in that, like I said, like human beings are not purely physical things.
Mm-hmm.
We are not existing in a purely physical world,
Mm-hmm.
right? And that's why I said religion is still around.
Yeah.
That's why, like you said, Mormonism is on the
Mm-hmm.
rise, and all these things. It's like because the world has to make more than physical sense
Sense.
to
That's right.
us. There is a spiritual element
Mm-hmm.
to it, and the more and more, like the more and more your science this tries to distance itself from that, the
Mm-hmm.
less
Human.
human
That's right.
it
Becomes right.
becomes, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which is I would say which is funny because the the creation of these things was meant to humanize our world,
Mm-hmm.
but it's made it more alien.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a point that we'll touch on
Right.
once we get to
Further.
later
Yeah.
on. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, let's continue this from here. But that's how Plato
Mm-hmm.
defines you know, real actual art,
Mm-hmm.
not as a tangible thing,
Right.
but as an ineffable
Mm-hmm.
thing that is created through a divine
Mm-hmm.
cause. And the reason why Homer and Ion, are so good and are revered in their field is because they have successfully created a link on a chain that
Mm-hmm.
is able to connect themselves and others to this divine cause, and
Mm-hmm.
it moves them and it moves everyone else.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So let's continue. Socrates. And don't you reciters interpret the poet's work? That is quite true also. So you are interpreters of interpreters. We are indeed. Then go on and tell me something more, my dear Ion. Don't hide it. Just answer my question. When you speak your vessels well and astound the audience most, you know when you sing how Odysseus leaps on to the threshold and reveals himself to the wooers and spreads out the arrows before his feet, or how Achilles rushes on Hector, or one of those touching scenes about Andromache or Hecuba or Priam. Are you in your right mind then, or do you get beside yourself? Does your soul feel itself inspired and present in the action when you describe somewhere in Ithaca or at Troy or wherever the epic scene is? Clear as daylight, I see your proof, my dear Socrates. I will not hide it. I will tell you frankly. Why, whenever I speak of sad and touching scenes, my eyes are full of tears. When it is something terrible or awful, my hair stands straight with fear and my heart leaps. Well then, my dear Ion, could we say such a man is for the time being in his right senses, who, decked out in gorgeous raiment and golden crown, burst out crying at a sacrifice or festival when he has lost none of these fine things? Or who is terrified, with more than 20,000 friendly faces about him, when no one robs him or wrongs him?
Mm-hmm.
No, upon my word, not at all, my dear Socrates, to tell the honest truth. And do you know that you reciters make most of the audience do the very same? Oh, yes, indeed, I do. I always look down from my platform, and they are crying and glaring and amazed, according to what I say. Indeed, I'm bound to pay careful attention to them. If I leave them crying in their seats, I shall laugh at my pockets full of money. If I leave them laughing, I shall cry over the money lost. Then, do you know that the member of the audience is the last of those rings which are described as getting power from each other through the magnet? You, the reciter and the actor, are the middle ring, and the first is the poet himself. But God, through all these, draws the souls of men whithersoever he will, by running the power through them, one after another. It's just like that magnet. And there is a great string of corsetors and producers and underproducers all stuck to the sides of these hanging rings of the muse. And one poet hangs from one muse and another from another, we call it possessed. And it is very like that, for he is held fast. And from these first rings, the poets, different people again, hang on each to his own poet, some to Orpheus and some to Musaeus, but most hang on to Homer. And they are possessed and held fast through the poet. And you are one of them, Ion. You are possessed through Homer. And whenever someone recites who belongs to another poet, you go to sleep and have nothing to say. But whenever someone chants a melody of this poet, you are awake in a jiffy, and your soul dances, and you have plenty to say. For it is not by art or science of Homer that you say what you say, but by divine dispensation and possession. Get so with the wild Corribans. The only melody which they quickly perceive is that which belongs to the god of whom they are possessed, whoever he is. And for that melody they have plenty of dances and songs, but they care nothing about the rest. The same with you, my dear Ion. Let anyone mention Homer, you are ready. For anyone else, you are dumb. And this is the reason why. This answers your questions why you have plenty to say about Homer and nothing about the others, because no art but divine dispensation makes you Homer's great encomiast. And an encomiast is just a praiser,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
someone who openly and publicly
Praises.
praises the
Mm-hmm.
works of someone else.
Mm-hmm.
And so
Mm-hmm.
yeah, like that's pretty much it. Just summed up everything we just said.
Make you think about a second line.
Yeah,
That's
like I
exactly
said,
like,
I like I said,
yeah,
we get that
yeah,
intuitively.
yeah, right,
We
right,
do that every
right.
Sunday at the Baptist
That's
church.
right,
We know what it means,
right.
to be moved
That's right.
by divine dispensation,
Mm-hmm.
whether you believe it or not. That
Mm-hmm.
feeling, you know, at least from their point of view,
Right.
from those who are being moved by it, is not of them.
Right.
It is otherworldly. It
Mm-hmm.
is ineffable. It
Mm-hmm.
is that divine thing. And I think, most people wouldn't have a problem calling it divine.
Right.
You know, But to me, that's something of a loaded term,
Yeah.
right?
Uh-huh.
I say ineffable as
Mm-hmm.
an as because it's other. It's something else.
Else. Right.
It's something else, something outside of that
Mm-hmm.
human frame.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it is God or not is
This.
your own
Right.
opinion.
Right. Mm-hmm.
But like he said, that's why you can't speak on what makes Homer any better. Why
Mm-hmm.
some people are moved by it and some people aren't. It's because it's not an art.
Right.
It's not a tangible thing.
Mm-hmm.
It is a divine. It is possession.
Right.
You are being possessed by the will and the
Mm-hmm.
words of
Right.
the muse
That experience.
of the
Mm-hmm.
divine
Right.
cause. That is what is moving you.
Mm-hmm.
So there is no art to that. There's no tangible reality to it.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing that can actually be, definite about it.
Mm-hmm.
It is merely, or you would say it is actually the God's will, the
Mm-hmm.
God's cause that is causing all of these
Mm-hmm.
things. You know. All right. This is Ion speaking. That is excellently said, Socrates, but I should be surprised if you could be eloquent enough to persuade me that I am always possessed and mad when I praise Homer. If you heard me speaking about Homer, I believe you would not think so yourself.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's just what I want to hear, but not until you answer one more question. What in Homer do you speak well about? Not everything, I suppose. Every mortal thing, my Socrates, I assure you. Surely not when he speaks about something which you do not know.
No. Right.
And what is there that Homer speaks about, which I don't
Don't
know?
know.
Why does not Homer speak often enough about arts and crafts? For example, driving a chariot. If I can remember the verses, I will repeat them. Oh, I'll say
Yeah.
them.
Right.
I remember. Then tell me what Nestor says to his son Antilochus in the horse race at the funeral of Patroclus, when he advises him to be careful in turning the post. This is what he says. Lean yourself over in your polished car a little to the left of both your steeds. Call to the right hand horse and goad him on, and slacken with your hand his reins. Then let the left horse swerve close round the turning post, so that the nave of well made wheel may seem to reach the stone's edge. But avoid to graze it. That will do. Now then, Ion, which would know better whether that is good or bad advice, a doctor or a charioteer?
Mm-hmm.
A charioteer, I suppose, because that's his own art. Or why? Because
Mm-hmm.
because it is his art. Well, has God granted to each of the arts to be able to know some particular work? For example, what we know by the art of the pilot, we shall not know by the art of physic. Of course not. And what we know by the art of physic, we shall not know by the art of carpentry. Of course not.
Mm-hmm.
And if that true of all arts, what we know by one we shall not know by another. But before that, answer me this: do you agree that there are different arts? Yes. Do you distinguish, as I do, would you call them different arts when they are the knowledge of different things? Yes. For I suppose that if one were only a knowledgeable of the same things as another, there would be no reason to call the arts different, for when you would know the same things from both. For example, I know that there are 5 fingers, and you know the same about them as I do. Then, if I asked you if we both knew it by the same art, arithmetic or different one, you would say, by the same, I suppose? Yes. Very well. Now tell me what I was going to ask you just now. Is this what you think about all arts in general? By the same art, we must know the same things, but by another art, not the same things.
Mm-hmm.
It, if it is another art, we must know different things by that. Yes, that is what I think, Socrates. And if anyone has not a certain art, he will not be able to know what is said or done well in that art. Quite true. Then take those verses which you repeated.
Mm-hmm.
Will you or a charioteer know better whether Homer speaks well or ill? A charioteer, because you are a reciter, not a charioteer. Yes, and the reciter's art is different from the charioteer's art. Yes, if it is different, then it is also a knowledge of different things. Yes. Well, then, when Homer says how Nestor's woman Hecamede gives wounded Macon a posset to drink, it goes something like this: with Pramnian wine, and over it she grates with a bronze grater goat's milk cheese and adds an onion as a relish for the drink. Whether this is good or bad in Homer, what will decide properly? The art of physic or the art of reciting? Physic. Again, when Homer says, "Into the deep she plunged, like a lead weight set in an ox horn, which goes hurtling down with death for greedy fishes," do we say this is rather for the fisherman's art to judge than the reciter's, whether it is good or bad? The fisherman's art, Socrates, that is clear. Look here then. If you were asking the questions, and if you should say, "Ah, well, Socrates, so much of these arts you find the places in Homer where each of these ought to decide, but kindly find something about a seer and his divination, which are the bits which we ought to be able to decide and say whether they are done well or badly." If you were to say that, see how easily and truly I shall answer. He speaks of these in many passages in the Odyssey. For example, what that seer of Melampolis' family says to the wooers, Theoclymenus, I mean, "Poor souls, what mischief on you? Night is wrapped about your heads and faces down to your feet. There is a blaze of wailing, cheeks bedabbled, the porch is full, the hall is full of spectres, hurrying to hell and darkness, and the sun put out in heaven. A foul mist covers all." There are many places in the Iliad too, as in the battle at the wall, where he says, "A bird came over as they tried to cross, an eagle flying high, striking their left, with a great serpent bleeding in his talons. Alive and struggling still, not yet forgetful of battle's joy, bent back it struck the bird that held it on the breast, hard by the neck. The eagle hurled it from him to the ground in agony, and down among the crowd it fell. He shrieked and flew on puffs of wind. These and other things, I should say, it is proper for the seer to examine and to decide. Yes, you are right in what you say, Socrates. I just want to stop right here, right quick,
Yeah.
because I like this. I like this the previous part because that's what I think like debaters and stuff do all the time.
Mm-hmm.
In that, like, Ion didn't ask that question about the
Right.
divinations. He was saying, if you were to ask
Right. If
this,
you were
I
right,
would then say
say
this.
this. Right.
It's like you're having this whole
It's
conversation with
right.
yourself about what you would say if
Right.
you were to ask that question.
Right.
But this whole part right here, this whole part right here
Mm-hmm.
is where I start to disagree
Mm-hmm.
with Plato.
Well, the thing that sticks out to me, and I think is if you go back right to where he starts, asking, the questions, right? And he says, when Ion gives an explanation about the way of the chariot, I guess, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you know, then he questions whether or not who would know better, the charioteer or
Mm-hmm.
whoever, right? And the thing that's, I guess, that Socrates hasn't mentioned yet, and probably won't mention, is whether or not Homer is actually correct, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
in describing and telling us, this
Mm-hmm.
particular thing. So while Socrates is saying, who would know best, the charioteer or whoever, right? But the thing that I guess is missing is whether or not, what is Homer? What does Homer actually know? And is he, correct in even describing this particular assessment?
Mm-hmm.
So,
Like he says that he's trying to say that as a as a reciter,
mm-hmm,
he cannot speak on the validity of the advice given
mm-hmm.
in Homer's. I think it was the Iliad.
Yeah, the Iliad, yeah.
You know,
Mm-hmm,
he cannot speak on the validity of Homer's advice
mm-hmm,
in that story,
mm-hmm,
but a charioteer can,
mm-hmm.
right? So like he said, like you can't speak on the whole of Homer,
Right.
right? You can't speak on the whole of Homer,
Mm-hmm,
you know. you don't really know if that advice there is good or bad advice, but the
Mm-hmm.
charioteer would.
Mm-hmm.
And when he says it, and with the advice about the other things, about
Mm-hmm.
the medicine, a
Right.
doctor would know
Right.
best, and with the,
Ion, the
the,
reciter.
the
Mm-hmm.
seers, the divine oracles
Mm-hmm.
that were given, that we just read,
Mm-hmm.
who would better be able to describe the validity of those
Mm-hmm.
things? Well, a seer would,
Mm-hmm.
right? And it's like, and like you said, if you're saying that Ion cannot speak on these
Right.
things, but what gave
Homer,
the
like
right to
Homer.
Homer the right to even write these things down?
Mm-hmm.
Because Homer is not a charioteer.
That's right.
Homer is not,
Right.
a
Doctor or seer,
doctor
right?
or an oracle,
Uh-huh.
right?
Right.
Oh, but according to your own logic, he doesn't need to be because it's not really Homer.
Mm-hmm. He's a. It's the
It's the divine
vine. Right. Right.
cause,
Right.
and the muse
Mm-hmm.
is all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
God is all these
Mm-hmm.
things. So Homer doesn't need to be.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need to be a character because he's merely interpreting God's will.
Right. And so therefore, if Homer doesn't need to be the
He doesn't need
to be
to speak on the validity of these things
right, so
because.
why would a reciter have to be? I mean, or why would anyone else?
But the thing is that they the thing that makes Ion
Mm-hmm.
incapable of speaking on these things is because Ion is interpreting Homer,
Right.
whereas Homer is interpreting God,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So then it's different
Uh-huh.
because he's being moved by a divine cause,
Right.
where you'll be moved by that divine cause as well, but you'll be moved by Homer,
Mm-hmm.
right?
So you're
You're connected
so
to
you're
Homer.
one of yeah, so you're one of
Homer is connected to
the yeah,
yeah.
Homer is I guess you could say is connected to the rock, right?
Mm-hmm.
He's like the first ring.
Yeah.
And Ion is connected to Homer, so he would be like the second ring
Mm-hmm.
on the rock. So the way that Homer would know a thing, is
Different.
different from how Ion would know a thing.
Yeah.
They both know the thing, but they just know it differently.
Well, Ion doesn't know.
He would right. He knows what Homer expresses.
Yes.
Right.
He knows what a Homer says.
Right.
But he doesn't. He can't speak on the validity
See,
of
right.
it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But when you say like, what gave Homer the right to say these things
Mm-hmm.
because he's not a charioteer? Well, the divine cause gave
Right.
him the right.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, like I said, that's where it falls apart for
Right.
me.
Mm-hmm.
Because, like I said, it is still a human pursuit, the
Mm-hmm.
creation of these things,
Mm-hmm.
right? And no, Ion may not, because Ion may not be able to speak, right, on the validity, quote unquote, and the veracity of how Homer is able to present this, the story about the charioteer and stuff like
Mm-hmm.
that. He may not be able to speak on the validity of it as a charioteer, but he
Mm-hmm.
can speak on it as an artist
Mm-hmm.
and how it relates to the rest of the art,
Right.
how it relates to the rest of the piece, and how it what it does to the story. He can
Mm-hmm.
speak on it on that
Mm-hmm.
avenue. He can speak on these
Right.
things. Homer can, because it's not purely divine and it's not
Mm-hmm.
as one to one
Mm-hmm.
as he's making it out.
Right.
You know.
It's like when I read a Sonia Sanchez, right?
Mm-hmm.
How differently it is when Sonia Sanchez reads
Mm-hmm.
Sonia Sanchez. And I think that the interpreter, like I would be considered the interpreter here,
The
right?
second
The
ring.
the second rank, right? That I am able to read it in a way that that may be able to, you know, to cause, the feelings and the adulation, those type of things. And But Sonia Sanchez, when she reads it, she's not able to capture it, those type of feelings that way. That does happen. I mean, if this is why you have performers, right? You have people who can write the thing, and you have those who can sing what the person wrote, and the singer is able to perform it in a way that the writer himself or herself is not able to perform it. So I see all of it working together, but not as one is more important than the other. I see it all.
Well, I don't think Homer is making the same. Not
No,
Homer.
no, 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 no.
I don't think.
I'm just putting it.
Yeah.
You're correct.
Yeah.
Plato is not. Well, Socrates is not saying that, and Ion is not saying
Yeah. Yeah.
that's
Like
just me.
he's not that.
You
I don't
know.
think he's saying that. That Homer is more important in that. But that if you're saying that, like I said, we had said that what gives Homer the right to even say these things,
Mm-hmm.
and why is it that Ion can't speak on it, but
Mm-hmm.
Homer can when they're both,
Mm-hmm.
artists? Is that, well, it's the proximity
Right.
to the
Exactly.
divine cause,
Right.
right? And that because he's not, Homer isn't an artist,
Mm-hmm.
right? Neither is Ion. They're
Right.
speaking from an
Right.
ineffable
From
place,
place. Right.
but it's like they are artists because
Yes.
interpretation, translation
Right.
is
Is
an art.
art.
It
Yes.
is like I say, it is a human pursuit.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a difference between artistry and accuracy.
Mm-hmm.
If you're saying that, can Ion speak on the accuracy,
The charioteer. Right.
of Homer's writings?
Mm-hmm.
No,
No.
right?
Right.
But he can speak on the artistry of it,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the whole idea that well, then he just can't speak at all
Right.
is,
Well, that's a leap.
yeah,
That's a reach. Right.
yeah, that doesn't
Right.
really translate,
Right.
you know. And again, and then it also depends on the charioteer, you know.
Yeah.
So one charioteer may say this is completely inaccurate.
Right.
Another charioteer saying, no, that's
Yeah.
completely
Yeah. Right.
accurate. It's like even that is
Even
not a
that.
definite thing,
Right.
and that's really the weakness
Mm-hmm.
here, is that there's this need for, like, for tangible.
Right.
Even like you describe Homer and all these,
Mm-hmm.
and Ion
Right.
as purveyors of the intangible,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Right.
But then you still need to make, your tangible points.
Mm-hmm.
Try to make it tangible for you to even make your point.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like you're contradicting yourself in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like, no one character is going to have one opinion. Like, doctors have very, like, one doctor can say that apples are good for you. Another doctor say no, you shouldn't be eating apples. Or
Right.
some doctors say that you gotta sleep 8 hours a day.
Right.
No, you gotta sleep 10 hours a day.
Right.
No, you only need like 4 hours.
Right.
Like there's no one.
Right.
It's not definite. It's
Right.
not as definite as, it's not as tangible
Mm-hmm.
as Socrates and Plato is making it
Making
out
out
to
to
be.
be. Right.
And that's where it falls apart,
Mm-hmm.
right? All
Yeah.
right.
The tangible thing would be, I guess you could say, is sleep. Outside of that,
Yeah. Outside of that, yeah.
you're left up to interpretation.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Right.
All right. So this is Socrates
Mm-hmm.
speaking. So are you, Ion. Well, now come, I have picked out from both Odyssey and Iliad pieces which belong to the seer, and to the doctor, and to the fisherman. Will you kindly pick out for me, since you are better up in Homer than I am, pieces which belong to the reciter, my dear Ion, and the reciter's art, which are proper for the reciter to examine and judge beyond the rest of mankind? My reply, my dear Socrates, is all Homer. Oh, dear Ion, surely not all. Have you such a bad memory? Surely a reciter ought not to have a bad memory. Why? What have I forgotten? Don't you remember that you said the reciter's art was different from the charioteer's?
Mm-hmm.
Yes, I remember. Did you not agree that being different, it would know different things? Yes. Then the reciter and his art will not know all Homer, according to your argument. This is,
Yeah.
no.
No.
All except perhaps a few things like that. By things like that, you mean all the business of the other arts, pretty well. For what will he know then, since he will not know everything? What is proper for a man to say, and so least I take it, or what a woman to say, what for a slave and what for a free man, what for a subject and what for a ruler?
Mm-hmm.
You know, like so Plato is saying that just that artists cannot speak at all.
Right.
You can recite the art,
Right.
you can move the people,
Mm-hmm.
but that's about it. You can't speak on any of the deeper meanings or
Right.
any of the other things. You can't you just can't speak on those
Right.
things.
Which we know is
And it's like you can tell like it's starting to get a bit political here.
right. Yeah. Because remember when we talked about it
Yeah,
yesterday, you could tell where
you can tell
where he's
where
going
he's
with
going.
this.
Like I said,
Right.
in the introduction, he talks about at least his opinion,
Right.
in the Republic.
Right. And I mentioned the word a particular
Yeah,
people, and you said
expert, qualified.
qualified. Yeah, we'll get into that.
Yeah,
Yeah.
he
Right.
said, that only qualified people can speak on a thing.
Right.
But when Ion says that I can speak on the whole of Homer, like
Right.
no, you can't,
Right.
right? But it's like I said, context,
Right.
context.
Right.
He can speak on it as an artist,
Right.
and that artistry that leads to a greater conversation about the work as a whole.
Right.
And there is no definite opinion
That's right.
about what a character or a doctor would say anyway.
Anyway.
So just trying to discount,
Right.
what Ion or what any artist would say about a
Mm-hmm.
particular thing because they are not a charioteer and they are not a doctor
Uh-huh.
it's reductionist.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is you're
We
getting
you
political.
know where we're going. Right.
You're
Right.
getting
Right.
political.
Right.
You're
Right. You know
saying
where we're
you're
going
saying
there. Right.
only qualified
Fine. Right.
people can speak on their particular subjects.
Uh-huh.
And it's like
Okay.
it's not that simple.
Simple.
It's
Yes.
not that simple.
That's right.
So we're like we see what you're trying to
Yeah.
lean
Yeah.
to.
Of course.
We see
Of
what you're trying to
course.
lean to.
Right.
Yeah. And Ion then goes on to say, well, what he can speak
Mm-hmm.
on the validity is what is proper for a man to say, or what a woman to say, or
Say it
what a
right.
slave or a
Mm-hmm.
subject or a ruler
Mm-hmm.
to say.
Mm-hmm.
And now
Here comes Socrates. Right.
Socrates is going to try to
Right.
deconstruct that.
Mm-hmm.
Do you mean what is proper to say for the ruler of a ship in a storm at sea? Will the reciter know that better than the pilot?
No, he didn't say that.
He take it completely out of
Yeah,
context.
yes. No, that's not what I'm saying. Right.
Oh no, the pilot would know that better.
Mm-hmm.
And what the ruler of a sick man ought to say, will the reciter know that better than a doctor? No, he won't know that either. But you say he knows what a slave ought to say. Yes. If, for example, the slave is an ox herd and his cattle are wild and he wants to calm them, you say the reciter would know what he ought to say and not the ox herd. Oh dear, no. Then what a woman ought to say about working wool, a woman whose business is to spin. No. Then he will know what a man ought to say if he is a general encouraging the troops. Yes, that is the sort of thing a reciter will know. Or the reciter's art is the general's art. I should know at any rate what the general ought to say. Perhaps you are something of a general, Ion. In fact, if you were something of a horseman as well as a harpist, you might know when horses were well or badly managed. But then I might ask of you, which of the two arts, Ion, makes you know the well-managed horse? The art by which you are a horseman, or the art by which you are a harpist? What would you answer me then? That which makes me a horseman. Well, if you could distinguish good performances on the harp, would you agree that you did it as being a harpist and not as a horseman? Yes. Well, since you understand military matters, do you do so as being a bit of a general or as being a good reciter? I think there's no difference. How's that? No difference. Do you say that reciting and generalship are one art or two? One, I think. Then whoever is a good reciter is also really a good general. Certainly, my dear Socrates. Then whoever is really a good general is also a good reciter. No, I don't think that.
Mm-hmm.
But you do think that whoever is a good reciter is also a good general.
Mm-hmm.
By all means. Well, you are the best reciter in Hellas. Much the best, my dear Socrates.
Why aren't you?
Then are you also the best general in Hellas? Yes, I assure you, Socrates, and I learned it all from Homer. Good heavens, my dear Ion. You are the best man of the nation, both reciter and general. Then why do you career all around hellish reciting and don't general at all? Do you think there is a great need for a reciter in our nations with a golden crown on his head and no need at all for a general? This is completely political now.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is completely political now.
Uh-huh.
The reason is, my dear Socrates, that my own city of Ephesus is under your state's rule and generalship, and needs no general of its own, and your state and Lacedaemon,
Mm-hmm.
these Greek
Yeah, right.
pronunciations, would not choose me as general, for you think you are enough by yourselves. Dear old fellow, don't you know Apollodorus of Cyzicus? Cyzicus? Is that how you say that? Who is he? One whom the Athenians have often chosen as general over themselves, although he is a foreigner. And Phanosthenes of Andros and Heraclides of Clazomenae, they are both foreigners, and they prove themselves men of merit. And so this our city invites them in for generalship and other high offices. But not Ion of Ephesus, it seems. Will she not choose him as general and honor him if he is considered a man of merit? Why aren't you Ephesians really Athenians in origins? And is not Ephesus no mean city? But really, my dear Ion, if you are telling the truth when you say that by art and knowledge you are able to praise Homer, you are cheating me. You declare to me that you know any number of fine things about Homer, and you promise to make an exhibition, but you only deceive me, and there is no exhibition. Far from it. You will not even tell me what these things are in which you are so clever, although I have been imploring you all this time. You are really nothing but a new Proteus, changing into all sorts of shapes and twisting up and down, and at last you escaped me and turned into a general, all to avoid showing me how clever you are in the lore of Homer. Well, if you are an artist, and if you are just promised to exhibit your art and then deceive me, as I said just now, you are cheating. If you are not an artist, but are possessed by divine disposition through Homer, and say all those fine things about the poet without knowing anything as I described you, then you are not cheating. Choose then which you prefer us to believe, a cheat or one divine. A great difference there, Socrates. It is much finer to be considered divine. Then the finer thing is yours, Ion. In our belief, you are divine, not an artist, when you eulogize Homer. The story ends there.
There, right. That particular dialogue is there.
That
right.
whole closing bit.
Yeah.
That is completely political.
Yes.
That is so he's pretty much saying that you can speak on it. You can't speak on the validity of these things because you don't actually know anything.
Mm-hmm.
All of it is actually divine dispensation. It's not coming from you.
That's
it's
right.
coming from this otherworldly force.
Mm-hmm.
So you can't really speak on the actions of generals and on the actions of the state. You can't speak on these things, right? You're not a politician. You're not a general.
Right.
And,
And I'm like, oh, Lord.
like you said,
Oh,
you're
no.
taking everything he's saying
All right.
completely out
Out
of
of context, right.
and using him to rob him of the agency to speak at all.
Right. Since you're asking and answering at the same time.
Yeah.
Right.
And then and it all comes down to either you're a cheater
Right.
or you're moved by a divine cause. What are you? And it's like that whole thing, like, oh man, that whole closing bit
Mm-hmm.
was completely political. Like so you establish the divine cause of these things to
Mm-hmm.
rob them of the agency to say anything at all
Right.
in the terrestrial, tangible, material world.
Mm-hmm.
The whole pursuit is metaphysical, right? The whole pursuit is metaphysical. So you cannot truly speak on the pursuits that are physical, that exist in the tangible world. And it's like
Don't go there.
I agree
Uh-huh.
with the metaphysical aspect
Uh-huh.
of artistry and expression as a whole.
No problem. But
But
nah. Outside of that, bro.
I say you're trying to draw these rigid lines in the
Mm-hmm.
sand here, and they just don't
Work.
It just don't work.
Uh-huh.
Especially when you try to do some stuff like that.
Yeah.
You literally try to say the man can't speak
At all, basically. He
And
doesn't know it, right?
You take everything he says out of context.
Right. Sounds
You know?
familiar. That sounds familiar. That sounds
But
like,
yeah,
like
I
techniques
said,
that we use today.
that's one of the things that was a big, I would say, one of the big
Mhm.
weaknesses
Right.
of philosophical thought at the time
Mm-hmm.
is that you try so hard to categorize and put everything in its place,
Mm-hmm.
that you end up philosophizing everything away,
Right.
and nothing is nothing.
Mm-hmm.
Because it can't be interrelated.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing can actually be connected. Everything is just what it is in and of itself. You know,
Mm-hmm.
and no wonder you philosophize your world away.
Yeah.
You philosophize your agency away. No wonder there was this massive massive rush towards science.
Mm-hmm.
And these because it allowed for normal people to
Right.
actually be able to speak
Speak. Right.
on their world again.
Right. It allows for the nuances.
Hmm.
It allows for that. The world is not this one thing, this rigid reality.
Like at the
It
very end, he
can't
pretty
be.
much said that
You,
you
you're
don't know
right.
anything, Ion.
Right.
So don't say
It's it.
anything. You're just an artist. You like literally that's the whole
Right.
ending part of this thing. It's like,
Right. You're not qualified
hmm,
to speak on whatever. And it's like,
it's funny, like the whole thing comes to you're not qualified to speak on war and the
right.
actions of state. You're not qualified to do that.
And what makes one qualified to even do that? And since we're going to Homer, I'm like,
What makes Plato
yeah,
qualified?
fine.
What makes
Socrates.
Socrates,
You know,
gives them the ability to even say these
right.
things?
And to give them any credence in
Yeah,
any conversations,
at all.
then and after. So that's the thing that we're constantly, running up against even now.
Hmm.
And I think it's in thinking about, Ani's book, Urugu, and how, she really delves into this. I'm like, it highlights it even more, how rigid, things.
How rigid, the colloquial
Mm-hmm.
ideals, in philosophical terms,
Right.
were being made.
Made.
How
Mm-hmm.
stringent everything was becoming, and
Mm-hmm.
you're going to see that play a very big role later on once we get to the Republic.
Public, right. Mm-hmm.
You know, because that's the whole thing. The whole thing is everywhere, everything being in the place it's supposed
Supposed
to
to be.
be in,
Mm-hmm.
and everyone being ruled by the philosopher king.
That's right.
And it's like we're going to dive into that later
Yeah.
on.
Yeah.
But in conclusion,
Mm-hmm.
right, our very first dialogue
Right.
was Ion,
uh,
right, and Ion claims to be the greatest,
reciter of
reciter
Homer.
of Homer and
Mm-hmm.
all
Mm-hmm.
these things. And throughout the story, you see how Socrates and Plato is able to challenge this ideal, right? And the idea that you know that an artist or that a person,
Mm-hmm.
you know, can be moved by something that is otherworldly,
Mm-hmm.
you know, is I think it's true. It's real.
Mm-hmm.
That can happen.
Yeah.
But to then say that because you are moved by a divine cause, you cannot speak on a
Mm-hmm.
thing is a very loaded statement. It is very political, and
Yeah.
it's just like it's dangerous.
Yeah.
It's
We'll get into
dangerous.
that because you already know what
It's
you
it's,
know
it's
where we're
this
going with
very
that, right?
dangerous mindset to
Mm-hmm.
say who can speak on
You
what
can't. That's right.
and who should be listened to.
Mm-hmm.
Especially when you're doing things that relate to all of us.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah,
Yeah.
that was Plato, right? If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments. And once again, thank you for hearing us out.
Thank you so much.